All right, guys. In this lecture, we're going to talk about hypotheses, what they are, how we make them, rules about making good hypotheses, and we're also going to talk, at least initially, about the philosophy of statistics. It's really important for you to understand the philosophy of statistics, for you to really appreciate why you're in this course. So let's get started here. Um, So, hypotheses are potential explanations that can account for observable phenomenon in the natural world. The key there is observable phenomenon and natural world. Natural is going to come into play in a second. Observable means something that we can see, not necessarily with our naked eye. It can be with a microscope. It can be the after effects of something that we see, like neutrinos plummeting through the atmosphere. Physicists can't actually see them, but they do see the after effects in a bubble chamber, which is a great way of testing whether or not neutrinos fall from the sky. Most importantly, when developing a hypothesis, I want you to get in the practice of saying these following words. I hypothesize that. It's so incredibly important for you to just pause right now and say it out loud. I hypothesize that. Now, the reason I'm stressing this, I know it seems silly, but the reason I'm stressing it is because even faculty members who write papers forget to include a hypothesis in their paper because it's just kind of an afterthought. You think that you have a hypothesis in your paper, but you don't really have one. But if you get in the practice of saying, I hypothesize that, you will never forget to include one. So many times, and I know might have happened with you, you wrote a paper and you thought you had one in there, but you didn't. Science is the search for evidence in support of a hypothesis. You could also say the search for evidence in support of observable phenomenon. That's fine too. Observable phenomenon lead us to a hypothesis, and so it's really the same thing. Science entails the search for evidence in support of a hypothesis. If we cannot find evidence to support a hypothesis, then we say we fail to support a hypothesis. We don't reject the hypothesis. We simply say, look, guys, we didn't find evidence to support it. We failed to support that hypothesis. We do not, in science, disprove a hypothesis. If we fail to find evidence to support a hypothesis, the hypothesis is not disproven. It's not false. It's just we just didn't find evidence to support it. Likewise, we actually never say that we prove a hypothesis either. Do not ever use those words, prove or disprove. We do not prove a hypothesis. Remember, the only thing that science does is right here. Science entails the search for evidence in support of observable phenomenon or a hypothesis, right? This is all that science does. It does not prove, it does not disprove. If you ever hear anyone say this proves or disproves, or this is not fact, they are full of bullshit. All right? Absolute bullshit. That is not what science does. For example, I can find evidence that does not support evolution. All right? You grew up thinking evolution is fact. It's not fact. It's a hypothesis. It's a hypothesis that we have found quite a lot of evidence for, but I can, and people have, found evidence that does not support the hypothesis of evolution. If I do find evidence that does not support evolution, it doesn't mean that I've disproven evolution. It just means that I have found a shred of evidence that might go against the grain of what everybody thinks. All right? But scientists, as a practice, do not believe or disbelieve. We merely search for evidence in support of observable phenomenon. All right, I said that in the previous slide. That's all that science does. We don't believe in something and we don't disbelieve in something. You can do that on your own time. But on science times, there is no proof. There's no fact, there's no truth, there's no belief. Science doesn't go to those words. The only thing we do is we find evidence. It's just evidence. Evidence is powerful. Well-collected evidence is powerful. A single piece of evidence can challenge long-held views, but it never generates fact or proof. Let's drive this home a little bit more. I hypothesize that the Earth is flat. All right? It is a perfectly legitimate hypothesis. It's a well-stated hypothesis. I hypothesize that the Earth is flat. You can make that hypothesis. And look, I'm going to tell you guys, it is definitely possible to find evidence in support of a flat Earth model. There was actually a really cool experiment that the Flat Earth Society always cites as being evidence in support of flat Earth. Basically, there was an observer here on the shore. That's a really long neck. And he had a telescope. Maybe it was a she. I don't know. I think it was a he. Anyways, he had a telescope. And that just looks like a really long cigarette. Anyways, he hypothesized that if the Earth was round, like this, then a ship, and here's my ship right here, a ship that is moving this way would eventually fall out of this person's line of view, okay? And so eventually, as the ship moved farther and farther and farther down away from this person, eventually he would lose sight of the ship. Now, what actually happened was that he never lost sight of the ship. It kept on being much longer. Like, eventually he would have lost sight of the ship, but in the span of distance in which his telescope worked, he continued to see the ship. And so he said, well, this suggests that the Earth is not round, that it is something else besides round. Well, in reality, we know what happens if there's light refraction at the horizon that causes light to bend around the horizon, so he could have seen this ship for a much longer way. Um, and also, there is the curvature of light around the planet, so it doesn't work exactly the way that he thought nature worked. So, it is definitely possible to find evidence in support of a flat Earth model. No doubt about it. It is possible to find evidence. However, evidence in support of flat Earth does not prove that the Earth is flat. It also doesn't disprove that the Earth is round. It's just evidence. It is evidence in support of one hypothesis. So, flat Earth evidence is real, but there's also a huge amount of evidence, including people who've been to space, that we call them astronauts, who have eyewitnessed, seen the Earth as being a sphere. So there's a lot of evidence against that hypothesis that the Earth is flat. So flat Earth evidence, because it's real and it's legitimate, it does challenge the concept of a round or spherical Earth. However, like I showed you with the example of the guy in the boat, in 100% of the cases, those challenges can be easily explained by other observable phenomenon like light refraction. It's quite easy. And oftentimes when we have a mountain of evidence in support of one hypothesis and a shred of evidence against that hypothesis, usually there's something fairly easy that can explain away. In some cases, there's not. And in some cases, those crazy hypotheses, those crazy ideas, they change science. And that's what's beautiful about it. I don't want the Flat Earth Society to disappear. They have a valid hypothesis, they have valid evidence. The problem is that they assert that that little tiny bit of evidence that they have disproves a spherical Earth. And that's simply not how science works. All right? Challenging evidence, by all accounts, is normal and it's a part of science. You should not be disturbed by people trying to find evidence in support of a flat Earth model. That's totally cool. In fact, I support people challenging common held assumptions or common held hypotheses because it means that they are independently thinking. However, you should be disturbed by people claiming that their evidence proves anything. And you should, more importantly, be disturbed by people who refuse to look at a mountain of other evidence when they have just this one tiny little shred of evidence. All right? This is kind of like the anti-vaccination folks who cling to this one study out of thousands and thousands and thousands of studies. The people who cling to one shred of evidence, and in reality that evidence was falsified data, so it doesn't matter anyway, but the people that cling to one shred of evidence are the people that we have a problem with. Making the leap between evidence and proof, fact, or truth is something called religion. And I don't mean to disparage religion. I just mean to say that that is what religion does. Religion originated because we could not explain what we were observing around us. There was no way for us to explain that. And so we created religion. Humans created religion because we needed a way to explain what was going on around us, to make us feel more comfortable about the way that our planet works. And so when we can't explain something, we make an irrational jump. So when we can't explain something, we make a leap from evidence to truth. That's not what science does. That's out of the realm of science. Science stops here. We don't go any further than that. I have no problem if you want to jump to truth. That's your own business. That's just not what science and statistics does. So, how to make a good hypothesis. Rule number one, a hypothesis must be falsifiable. All right? And what do I mean by that? I mean that you have to be able to find evidence that could cause us to accept or reject a hypothesis. There has to be a way, there has to be a set of data that you could collect that would allow you to accept or reject a hypothesis. There are three primary reasons for a hypothesis to not be falsifiable. The first two we can get around. And the third is a bit of a problem. The first reason is that a hypothesis is subjective. I hypothesize that chocolate ice cream tastes better than vanilla. All right, that's a subjective hypothesis. I can certainly hypothesize that I prefer chocolate ice cream over vanilla. There are behavioral tests that I can do, but I can't hypothesize that in general chocolate ice cream tastes better than vanilla because that's clearly a subjective response. I can hypothesize that chocolate ice cream has different flavonoid compounds in it that give different sensations to different people. That's certainly possible. But I can't hypothesize, I can't find any evidence to say that one is objectively better than the other. Second reason is because something is beyond our technical grasp. For example, saying that there are living beings in the Andromeda galaxy is totally fine, except we can't find any evidence for that given our current technology. It's just beyond our technical grasp. It's not to say that we can't do it one day. Certainly one day there will be a way for us to test hypotheses that are currently out of our technical grasp. But if you make a hypothesis right now that we can't actually test, it's a non-falsifiable hypothesis and it doesn't work. You can't have that. The third thing, demonic intrusion is the hypothesis that supernatural phenomenon lead to observations. Now, demonic intrusion is a legitimate phrase. It was cited by a guy named Hurlburt. Anyway, demonic intrusion simply says that there is things that are controlling the world around us that are supernatural. Science is based in the natural world. We can only use natural forces to explain what we observe. So if something is supernatural, we can't find evidence. Although it might actually be the cause of our observations, we can never find evidence to support or reject that idea. It is outside the realm of science. And this is often why I say you can be a scientist and someone who is religious at the exact same time, because one simply does not touch the other. Religion usually makes a leap from evidence to a God controlling things, and that's totally fine. Science can't touch that hypothesis. It's no way, because demonic intrusion does not allow testing. All right, so demonic intrusion is always going to be a non-falsifiable hypothesis. Rule number 2, hypotheses should be simple and directional. When you make a hypothesis, you should ask yourself, as my hypothesis is stated, do I already know the answer to this hypothesis? If so, if you already know the answer, make a better one. For example, I hypothesize that climate change is due to humans. This is not a very good hypothesis. What human activity? Where? All right, we can make that a better hypothesis. All right, I hypothesize that an increase in weather variability is due to a gradual increase in human-driven carbon emissions. Notice, an increase in weather variability is due to an increase in human-driven carbon emissions. Going back, I have given it direction. So let's practice. I'm going to show you a video. This is one that I just want you to sit back and observe, all right? Why do you think that this little crab is doing this? Right now, wherever you are, develop a hypothesis. Write it down if you can. Say, I hypothesize that. Remember, I want you to start with that. I hypothesize that this crab is doing this behavior for this reason. Okay? Let's go through bad hypotheses. First, a subjective hypothesis, a non-falsifiable hypothesis because it is subjective. I hypothesize that the anemones make the crab happy. I don't know what happy is to the crab. Happy is a subjective term that humans put on things that we assume that other organisms. We don't know what happy means. It's a subjective hypothesis. We can't really test that. Now, there are behavioral psychologists out there that try to define happiness using neural activity, etc. And there we can kind of get around this subjectivity. Like I said, it's possible to get around it. But as stated, this is not really a testable hypothesis because it's not falsifiable. One that's beyond our technical grasp. I hypothesize that the crab communicates telepathically with the anemone. You know what? It may actually happen. But currently, we don't have the ability to test that, so it's beyond our technical grasp. It's not falsifiable. Third, demonic intrusion. I hypothesize that God made the crab do this. Okay, you know what? He might have, or she might have, or it, or whatever you want to call God, might have done this. But we can't test it. It's not falsifiable. There is no set of evidence that we could find that would prove or disprove this hypothesis because it's beyond natural grasp. Another example of a bad hypothesis, it's not directional here. I hypothesize that the anemones affect crab survival. All right, you know what? Yeah, it does. It probably does. By holding those anemones, it probably affects the crab survival. After all, why else would the crab do it? I hypothesize that the anemones affect crab survival. That's fine, sort of. I mean, yes, you can make the hypothesis, but it's not really good because it's not specific. I often say that when somebody makes a hypothesis like this, they're hiding under a canopy of uncertainty. They're afraid to put their foot down and actually say something such as, I hypothesize that holding the anemones makes the crab less vulnerable to predators. This is a simple and directional, testable, falsifiable hypothesis. It's okay if you do an experiment and you don't find evidence to support it. It's okay. It's not like you've committed any sin. You can make a hypothesis. You don't have to be vague with the hypothesis. It's just a statement. Assert something. Say, I hypothesize that holding the anemones makes the crab less vulnerable to predators. All right? An even better hypothesis. I hypothesize that anemones and crabs form symbiotic relationships that improve each other's growth and survival. In conclusion, hypotheses should be falsifiable, meaning that there should be evidence that you can find that will reject or fail to reject that hypothesis, and they should give direction to the correlation and lead straight into what we call a prediction. Hypotheses and predictions are two different things. So let's talk about what a prediction is.
We're gonna have a good time tonight. Let's celebrate. Yeah, it's alright. Yeah, we're gonna have a good time tonight. Let's celebrate. It's alright. Yeah, celebrate good times. Come on.
Oh, and we got a lot to celebrate today. Hey, do y'all want to get your pants off? Do you want to dance your pants off? Just clap your hands.
A prediction is a statement that follows. It naturally follows from your hypothesis. We say, given my hypothesis, I predict that. Again, pause and say this out loud to yourself. Given my hypothesis, I predict that. In any paper, you should have those two statements. I hypothesize that, ... Given my hypothesis, I predict that, ... In environmental science, a hypothesis is often system non-specific, meaning that if we were to observe something with crabs and anemone, the hypothesis doesn't actually deal with crabs and anemones. It might deal with symbiosis in general, whereas a prediction is system specific. So the prediction would deal with crabs and anemones. This will become clear as we practice more and more. I will give you an example here, again with the crab. I hypothesize that corals form symbiotic relationships with reef dwellers that improve each other's growth and survival. Given this hypothesis, I predict that there is a positive correlation between the amount of time a crab holds onto an anemone, and the survival of the crab and the growth of the anemone. All right, this is a very detailed prediction, but it follows from that more general hypothesis that corals form symbiotic relationships. It doesn't have to deal with crabs. It just is a general statement about symbiotic hypotheses. All right, now, once we have an observation, we can generate hypotheses through a variety of different methods. The first one is deduction. Deduction is when we develop a hypothesis by proceeding from the general case to the specific case. An example: I observe that crabs that hold anemones are not preyed upon. They suffer low predation. I found a crab with an anemone. And number 3, if you can guess it, is the crab that I found will not be eaten. Right? Notice how we started off with the broad, all right, all observations, and we narrowed it down to our current observation, and we made a hypothesis based on that current observation. Another example: there have been no alien landings in the United States. All right? That's a general statement about everything in an area. Roswell is in the United States. As a consequence, there have been no alien landings in Roswell. That is deduction, where we start with the broad, we start with a general statement about how the world works, and we focus in from there. Induction is where we develop a hypothesis by proceeding from the specific case to the general case. I found a crab that has never been eaten. So I actually found this crab. I went scuba diving and I found this crab. The crab is holding an anemone. Therefore, I hypothesize that crabs that hold anemones are never eaten. We've gone from the very specific observation that we found to a more general statement about how the world works. Going back to Roswell, there have been no alien landings in Roswell. Roswell is in the United States. I hypothesize that there have been no alien landings in the United States. We start with one specific piece of evidence, and we use that evidence to fuel a more general hypothesis. This is known as induction. Although the deductive method tends to confer a more confident conclusion about what you are currently observing, remember, we know something more general about the system, and therefore we can make a conclusion about what we're currently observing. It also requires that you know a lot about the system, and that's not often the case. We don't know that there have been no alien, well, I guess we do know that, I don't know. Maybe there have been alien landings in the United States. Anyways, we also don't necessarily know that crabs with anemones are rarely eaten. We simply observed something specific, and we want to make a broad hypothesis from that. And for that reason, we usually use the inductive method in science and statistics. The inductive method starts with a singular observation and works outwards from there, using that singular observation to make a broad statement about how the world works. Science and statistics are generally inductive processes. We draw general conclusions from point observations. Now, to generate a hypothesis using inductive reasoning, you want to make an observation and then suggest a mechanism to explain that observation. Right? You make a pinpoint observation. That crab is holding anemones. You make that observation and then you suggest a mechanism to explain it. The hypothesis leads you to make predictions that would support your hypothesis. Most of you use the inductive process because you make observations. You don't make general statements about how the world works and use that to make an observation. You make singular observations, and you use those singular observations to make general hypotheses. Right? You see a cormorant dive into the water, you hypothesize that cormorants dive into water to find fish. Okay? You see something and then you explain it.
Yeah! A little more waving. Here we go. Celebrate it. Celebrate your life. We are. Come on. Oh, yeah. Celebrate it. Celebrate nice and
When you make a hypothesis, it is okay to alter your hypothesis using previous data. A lot of people think that when they make a hypothesis, they can't go back and change that hypothesis. That's bullshit. You can always change your hypothesis. It's just a statement. There's nothing set in stone. If you make an observation, you come across a hypothesis, you find evidence to support that hypothesis, fine, great. If you don't find evidence to support that hypothesis, use that data and change your hypothesis. Totally cool. We all do that. Now, in this example, this is pretty much the scientific method. You make an observation, you create a hypothesis. From that hypothesis, given that hypothesis, you make a prediction. You create experiments and data, you make more observations. If the observations match your predictions, which are right here, if the observations match your predictions, then yeah, you've accepted your hypothesis. If you don't, then modify your hypothesis. That's totally cool, not a problem. There are problems, however, with using the inductive method to make hypotheses. First of all, you tend to start out with one hypothesis, and this hypothesis might be wrong. When you work in a microbiology laboratory, for example, or a physics laboratory, and you spend, let's say you spend $18 billion in creating a hadron super collider bordering two countries to test a singular hypothesis that could be wrong, you might be going down the wrong path, and it might be a huge waste of time and money. Number two, since there is no guideline to decide when you really should abandon a hypothesis altogether, for example, if you make new observations and those observations don't match your predictions, you might say, no, you're going to modify that hypothesis slightly, but you're not going to abandon it and choose a whole nother hypothesis, right? You're just going to modify that hypothesis. You're going to do another set of experiments, and you're just going to be stuck in this loop forever. Instead of just abandoning this and moving on to a brand new hypothesis, it's called the pet hypothesis problem. You really want to keep an open mind and be ready to completely abandon something. I tell this to graduate students all the time that ask me for advice. I say, just keep your mind open. Be ready to just write off years of work as, you know what, I stepped down the wrong path. It's okay. I want to stress that when you make a hypothesis, allow your intuition to guide your hypothesis making. It is perfectly okay to use your prior knowledge of a system and your gut feelings. I use my gut feelings all the time. I say, you know what, I really don't think that we're going to see anything with this. And I could totally be wrong. That's fine. At least, I would say, the majority of the time, your intuition and your gut feeling about things is going to help you out, okay? Now, I will say, it would be better to start off with multiple hypotheses. Instead of one, you start off with multiple hypotheses, and you test each one of those hypotheses in turn. This is something known as the hypothetico-deducto method. All right, you don't need to know that term. Let's say that we observe that all cows graze while facing the same direction. Now, we don't have to observe this. It actually happens. There was a really cool study where this person went to Google Earth and she looked at cow ranches, and she observed which way the cows were facing. And it turns out all cows face the same direction when feeding. Not just all cows on a single farm, but all cows face the same direction in a huge swath of area like Texas when feeding. Why do they do that? Well, this is a great study. We don't actually know the reason why, so I'm going to, spoiler alert, I don't have an answer for you. But we can at least make a hypothesis. Let's make a silly hypothesis. I hypothesize that cows graze in the same direction to avoid sunburn. It's not a silly hypothesis, that's legitimate. Maybe they try to avoid the direct sun, and that's what orients them all in the same direction. We could also make an alternative hypothesis. I hypothesize that cows graze in the same direction in order to streamline themselves with the wind. That way they don't topple over if a huge wind gust happens. Or maybe they're worried about their farts or something. Like they want all of their farts to not hit them in the face, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, it's an alternative hypothesis. So instead of starting out with one hypothesis, we start off with multiple hypotheses. And we have multiple predictions. And from all of that, we create an experiment to test those predictions. And we can go back to the drawing board here and say, well, hypothesis A didn't really work out, hypothesis C and D didn't really work out, so hypothesis B is good. This is a much better way of doing science because it doesn't waste time. We start off testing a whole bunch of different hypotheses. Now, your hypotheses should be very different from one another. There's this thing called Bible code, which is where somebody went through the Bible with a computer to find a whole bunch of different secret codes in the Bible using pattern recognition. All right. What happened is they found something, but they didn't make a hypothesis about what they would find. They just said, we're going to find something. Let's look for it. This is called fishing. All right. You simply are looking for something. If you didn't know what you were looking for in the first place, and you wind up trying to explain your observations as if you did know what you were looking for, you're going to come up with nonsense. As it turns out, you can do this with any major book. They wound up doing this with Moby Dick, which if you've ever read that book, it's a boring expose on whales. They found patterns in Moby Dick too, just to prove that you can't go at an experiment with infinite number of different possible explanations. All right. The practice of fishing for hypotheses is becoming more and more common. One of the reasons why it's becoming more and more common is because we have advanced tools to make all sorts of measurements out in the world. For example, the world of artificial intelligence and data learning is creating ways of dealing with immense amounts of data. We did this with the Genome Project, where we had a computer try to pair up genes with phenotypes in a million different ways and try to find different codes in the genotype that would help us function. All right, it's a problem way beyond human capacity, human brain capacity. Computers can do it. However, what happens is that the computer spits out nonsense most of the time. And if you don't know what you're looking for, you're going to try to explain that nonsense. All right? If you assume that everything a computer spits out actually means something, then you're really going to be at a severe risk of falsely accepting something as if it were real when it's actually false. And for that, stay tuned for the next lecture. We're going to talk about type 1 and type 2 risks, and this will make even more sense.